Hello there everyone, welcome to Nightmare Narratives. I am your storyteller and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep, so before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm always curious, where are you watching from and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, find your cozy spot and relax. My name is Marcus Whitmore, and I've been a ranger in the Olympic National Forest for 14 years. I've seen plenty of things that would make most people pack up and head back to the city. Bear attacks, hikers who got lost and never made it home, accidents that happen when people don't respect the wilderness. But what I'm about to tell you is different. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. I'm 38 years old, a widowed Marine who came back from the war with too many memories and not enough peace. The forest became my sanctuary after my wife Sarah died in a car accident 3 years ago. Out here in the Quinault River Valley, 30 miles from the nearest town, I could find the quiet I needed. The old-growth trees, some of them 800 years old, had a way of putting human problems in perspective. It was October 1967, deep into fog season. The temperature hung around 40 degrees, and by 4 in the afternoon, darkness would start creeping through the canopy. This was when the forest felt most alive and most dangerous. The fog rolled in thick from the Pacific, turning familiar trails into something from another world. I'd been working search and rescue for most of my career. When the Morrison family didn't check in after their 3-day hiking trip, I got the call. Jim Morrison, his wife Carol, and their 2 kids, Tommy, 8, and Susan, 6. They were from Seattle, experienced hikers who knew the rules. They had good gear and a solid plan to hike the Enchanted Valley Trail. The thing is, I'd promised Sarah before she died that I'd always do everything I could to keep families safe out here. She used to worry about me, said the forest was too dangerous for one man to handle alone. Promise me you'll bring them all home, she'd said during one of our last conversations. It was the kind of promise you make to someone you love, never thinking you might have to break it. The Morrison case was different from the start. When experienced hikers don't check in, it usually means injury or equipment failure. Simple problems with simple solutions. But as I drove my truck up the old logging road to their last known position, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. The local Quinault tribe had stories about this area, old stories, the kind that get passed down for generations. They talked about something called the Seatco, a giant forest guardian that had turned evil. Most people wrote it off as folklore, campfire stories to scare tourists. I'd always been one of those people, until I found what was left of the Morrison family. I found their Volkswagen van first, parked at the trailhead exactly where it should be, keys still in the ignition, map spread out on the dashboard showing their planned route. Everything looked normal until I walked around to the back. Their gear was laid out with perfect precision. The children's backpacks were arranged in a straight line, contents organized in a way that made my skin crawl. Socks folded neat as military bunks, snacks arranged by size, toothbrushes lined up like soldiers. No parent packs their kids' stuff that carefully, especially not during a camping trip. I followed the trail toward their planned campsite, my radio crackling with static. The fog was getting thicker, turning the familiar path into something alien. That's when I found their tent. It was shredded, but not the way you'd expect from a bear attack. The cuts were clean, surgical, for parallel slashes through the nylon, made from the outside. Inside, everything was neat and tidy. No signs of struggle, no blood. The sleeping bags were still zipped up, pillows fluffed like they were ready for bedtime. I'd seen bear attacks before. They're messy, violent. This was something else entirely. That's when I noticed the silence. In 14 years of working these woods, I'd never heard anything like it. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth. Just dead quiet, despite the fact that I could see the tree canopy moving in the wind above me. I called it in on my radio, but all I got was static mixed with something that sounded like humming. Low frequency, almost below the range of hearing. It made my teeth ache. My compass started spinning wildly. North, south, east, west. The needle couldn't decide. I'd been using that compass for 10 years, never had a problem with it. But out here, it was useless. That's when I found the first tracks. 18 inches long, humanoid, but wrong. 5 toes, each ending in what looked like 6-inch claws. The stride length was impossible, nearly 10 feet between prints. Whatever made these tracks was big, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. I followed the tracks uphill, away from the campsite. The air got colder with each step, dropping what felt like 15 degrees. My breath started coming out in puffs, even though it had been mild weather all day. The tracks led to a massive Douglas fir, maybe 8 feet around. Something had clawed it up, leaving 8 parallel gouges that started 8 feet off the ground and went up another 4 feet. The bark was stripped away in a decorative pattern, like something had been marking territory. But it was the smell that really got to me. Musk, mixed with rotting meat and something else. Something chemically wrong that made my eyes water. It hung in the air like a fog all its own. I found the first blood trail at the base of the tree. Human blood, no question about it. Not enough to suggest fatal wounds, but enough to know someone was hurt. The drops led deeper into the forest, toward the old Quinault burial grounds that were marked off limits to hikers. As I followed the trail, I kept getting the feeling I was being watched. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. The feeling was so strong that I drew my service weapon, a .357 revolver that had never failed me. I lost 3 hours somewhere along that trail. 1 minute I was following blood drops up a hillside. The next I was standing in a clearing 2 miles off my original path, with no memory of how I got there. The sun was setting, and I had no idea what happened to the afternoon. That's when I heard the sound that still wakes me up at night. A howl, but not from any animal I'd ever heard. It was too intelligent, too purposeful. It echoed through the forest like a signal, and I knew with absolute certainty that something had been watching me all day. Something that knew I was there and wanted me to know it was there too. I found Tommy Morrison the next morning, 200 feet up in the canopy of an old cedar tree. My backup had arrived during the night. Bill Davidson, a 20-year veteran, ranger who'd worked as a logger before joining the service. Bill was tough as nails, the kind of man who didn't scare easily. When he saw me stumbling back to the trailhead after dark, pale and shaking, he knew something was seriously wrong. We went back to the blood trail at sunrise. Bill brought climbing gear, thinking maybe the family had tried to get to high ground for some reason. Neither of us was prepared for what we found. The boy's body was positioned to face east, toward the sunrise. His limbs had been twisted into an unnatural pattern, arranged like he was reaching for something. Around him, pine cones were laid out in a perfect spiral, each one placed with deliberate care. "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered, then threw up over the side of the branch we were standing on. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the positioning, it was the lack of claw marks on the tree trunk. Tommy weighed maybe 60 pounds, but getting him up there should have left gouges in the bark. There were none. Whatever did this had placed the boy in that tree without climbing. We found Carol Morrison in an underground cave formed by the roots of a massive spruce. She was curled up in a fetal position, like she was sleeping. Her body showed no signs of decomposition despite being missing for 4 days. Her skin was waxy and pale, but she looked almost peaceful. Bill started shaking when we found her. This man who'd faced down charging bears and pulled loggers out from under fallen trees was trembling like a child. "This isn't natural predation," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is intelligence. This is something that thinks." We found Jim Morrison hanging from the old log bridge over Cascade Creek. He'd been positioned so he was facing back, toward where his family had been camping. The rope wasn't tied, it was twisted around his neck like a vine, organic and deliberate. That's when I realized what we were looking at. This wasn't random killing. The bodies were arranged to tell a story. The father had been forced to watch his family die before his own death. Someone, or something, had wanted him to suffer. Susan, the 6-year-old, was still missing. We found fresh blood drops leading away from her father's body, heading toward the forbidden burial grounds. The amount of blood suggested she was wounded but alive. Bill refused to go any further. He kept saying something was in his head, making him see things. Images of his own family dying, visions of his own death. He grabbed my arm with both hands and begged me not to continue. "It's not just killing them," he said. "It's playing with them, playing with us." My radio had stopped working entirely. By then, instead of static, it was producing sounds that resembled human screaming. High-pitched wails that rose and fell like a siren. I turned it off. but I could swear I still heard the sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. I continued, alone, following Susan's blood trail as it wound through stands of old growth fir toward the sacred quinault ground. The tribal warnings were posted every 50 yards, sacred ground, no entry, but I had a little girl to find. The temperature kept dropping as I climbed. The fog got thicker, reducing visibility. To maybe 10 feet my breath came out in white puffs, and frost started forming on the fallen logs around me. The blood trail led to a 40-foot waterfall that cascaded into a dark pool below. The tracks showed that Susan had been carried, not dragged. Whatever had taken her was strong enough to carry a child while maintaining perfect balance on treacherous terrain. At the edge of the waterfall, I found something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the rock face were symbols I didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar. They seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Below the symbols, scratched into the stone in a child's handwriting, were 2 words. It showed me. That's when I heard Susan crying. The sound came from behind the waterfall, where the rock face formed a natural cave. I rappelled down using Bill's climbing gear, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the ropes. Inside the cave, I found what could only be described as a nest. Human bones arranged in careful patterns, mixed with branches and moss and things I didn't want to identify. At the center, Susan Morrison sat perfectly still, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing. She was alive, but something fundamental had been broken inside her. When I touched her shoulder, she didn't react. When I spoke her name, she didn't blink. But she was breathing, and her heart was beating, and that was enough. As I lifted her to carry her out, she spoke for the first time. "It showed me what happened to everyone," she whispered. "It showed me what's going to happen to you." The creature emerged from the fog like something out of a nightmare. 9 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair that seemed to absorb light. Its eyes were amber, bright and intelligent in a way that made my skin crawl. This wasn't an animal. This was something that had once been human. Susan went completely rigid in my arms, not from fear, but from recognition. "That's him," she said, in a voice too calm for a six-year-old. "That's the one who arranged everyone." The creature didn't make a sound as it approached. It moved with perfect balance despite its size, feet placing themselves with deliberate care on the rocky ground. When it was close enough that I could smell its breath, rotting meat, and something sweet like overripe fruit, it spoke, not with its mouth. The words appeared directly in my mind, clear as if someone was standing next to me. "She sees what I've shown her. She understands the pattern now." Images flooded my brain. Sarah's car accident, but shown from a different angle. Me finding her body, but with details I'd never noticed. My future death, played out in a dozen different ways. The creature wasn't just showing me random visions. It was demonstrating its knowledge of my past and its ability to see my future. "You were a soldier," the voice in my head continued. "You killed men. You understand survival." More images. A man in 1880s clothing, trapped in a cabin during a brutal winter. His family starving. The moment he made the choice to eat them too. Survive. The transformation that followed, as cannibalism changed him into something no longer human. "I was like you once. I made the choice to live." The creature reached out one massive hand towards Susan. Its fingers were too long, ending in black claws that looked sharp enough to cut through bone. I raised my revolver and fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets hit, drawing blood and staggering the creature backward, but it didn't fall. Instead, it looked at me with what might have been amusement. "Iron," it said in my mind. I remember iron. That's when Bill came back. I heard him crashing through the underbrush before I saw him, shouting my name. He'd brought 2 sheriff's deputies with him, men I'd worked with before. Good men who knew the forest and knew how to handle themselves. The creature moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. It covered the distance to the first deputy in 3 strides, reaching out almost casually to snap the man's neck. The sound was like breaking kindling. The second deputy got off 2 shots with his shotgun before the creature backhanded him into a tree trunk. I heard his spine break from 20 feet away. Bill tried to run with Susan, but the creature was on him before he'd taken 10 steps. It grabbed his head in both hands and twisted, quick and efficient. Bill dropped like a sack of grain. I was alone with the creature and a traumatized little girl. My military training kicked in. I couldn't outrun it, and I couldn't outfight it, but I could outsmart it. The creature had been human once, which meant it still had human fears buried. Somewhere in its transformed mind, I pulled out my emergency flare and ignited it. The red light filled the cave, and for the first time, the creature showed something like fear. It backed away from the flame, making a sound that was part growl, part whimper. Fire, the one thing that could still touch its human memories. I used the flare to drive it back while I gathered dry wood and moss. Within minutes, I had a barrier of flame between us and the creature. It paced back and forth beyond the fire, amber eyes reflecting the light, but it wouldn't cross the line. Fire, I said out loud. You remember fire, don't you? You remember being human enough to fear it. The creature's mental voice was different, now tinged with something that might have been pain. Fire burns the pattern. Fire destroys the arrangement. I kept the fire burning all night, feeding it with branches and moss, while Susan slept against my shoulder. The creature stayed just beyond the light, watching, waiting. Sometimes it would test the barrier, reaching one long arm toward the flames, but it never crossed the line. At dawn, it spoke one last time. You cannot burn the forest forever. Soldier, I am patient. I have been patient for 87 years. Then it melted back into the fog, like it had never been there. The official report listed the Morrison family, deaths as a bear attack. Bill Davidson was reported as having died from a fall during the rescue operation. The 2 deputies were killed by the same bear that got the family. Nobody asked too many questions. People die in the wilderness sometimes. It's a fact of life that anyone who works out here learns to accept. Susan Morrison survived, but she never spoke again about what happened. The doctors said she was in shock, that she'd eventually get better. But I knew better. She'd seen something that no child should see, something that had broken part of her mind. She drew pictures sometimes, crayon drawings of stick figures being arranged by a tall, dark shape. The doctors thought it was part of her healing process. I knew it was her way of trying to warn people. I requested a transfer to Mount Rainier National Park. The paperwork went through without any problems. Nobody wanted to ask why a 14-year veteran suddenly needed to leave his post. I started drinking too much, started having nightmares. Every night, I tried to marry a local teacher, a good woman who deserved better than what I could give her. The marriage lasted 8 months before she left, saying I was haunted by something I couldn't talk about. She was right. But the creature is still out there. Every few months, hikers report feeling watched in the Quinault Valley. Some don't come back. The disappearances are always during fog season, always in October when the darkness comes early. I leave coded warnings in the trail registers now. Notes about unusual animal activity and recommended alternative routes. Nothing that would make me sound crazy, but enough to maybe save a family from making the same mistake the Morrisons made. Because I know the truth that I can never put in an official report. There's something in those woods that was once human, something that learned to survive by becoming something else entirely. It's patient, it's intelligent, and it's not finished with its work. The pattern isn't complete yet. And somewhere in the Olympic National Forest, in the fog and the darkness between the ancient trees, it's still arranging things, still waiting for the next family to come hiking in October. My name is Marcus Whitmore. And I'm telling you this story because you need to know. If you're planning to visit the Quinault Valley, if you're thinking about camping in the old-growth forest during fog season, please reconsider. Some promises are impossible to keep. Some things are too dangerous to face alone. And some things that were once human should stay buried in the woods where they belong. My name is Alina Reeves, and I've been a ranger in the Superior National Forest for 11 years. People think it's a quiet job, but when you're dealing with Minnesota winters and thousands of acres of wilderness, quiet can turn deadly fast. I'm half Ojibwe, though I didn't grow up on the reservation. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old spirits that lived in these woods. Wendigo, she called them. Giants that ate people when the winter got too hungry. I always figured they were just stories to keep kids from wandering off into the forest. February 1978 was the coldest I'd ever seen. The thermometer hit 40 below for 6 straight days. That's cold enough to freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. Cold enough to kill you in minutes if you're not careful. The kind of cold that makes the trees crack like gunshots in the night. I was stationed at the Boundary Waters, right on the Canadian border. Beautiful country most of the time, but in winter it becomes something else. Something that doesn't want you there. We only got about 6 hours of real daylight, and the rest was just grey twilight that made everything look dead. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 3 brothers from Duluth had gone ice fishing up on Basswood Lake. Jake, Pete, and Mike Kowalski. They'd been due back 3 days ago, but nobody had heard from them. Their families were worried sick, probably just having too good a time, my supervisor said over the radio. You know how fishermen are, but I didn't think so. These weren't weekend warriors. The Kowalski brothers knew the woods. They'd been coming up here for 15 years. They knew you didn't mess around when it got this cold. I loaded up my snowmobile with emergency gear and headed out. The wind was howling across the lake, picking up snow and throwing it around like glass dust. My face mask froze solid within the first mile. The ride to their camp took 40 minutes through forest that looked like it had been carved from ice. The trees were white with frost, and they creaked and groaned in the wind like they were in pain. Every now and then, one would crack from the cold with a sound like a rifle shot. I found their camp on the north shore of the lake, exactly where they'd said they'd be, but something was wrong right away. Their tent was still up. Their gear was laid out neat and tidy. 3 holes were cut in the ice, still unfrozen, even though nobody had been tending them for days. In this cold, those holes should have been solid ice blocks. I called out their names, but the wind just carried my voice away. I checked the tent. Sleeping bags still rolled out, food still in the coolers. Even their emergency flares were untouched. These guys hadn't run out of food. They hadn't gotten lost. Something else had happened to them. I walked around the camp, looking for clues. That's when I noticed the ice around their fishing holes. It wasn't just unfrozen. It was formed in perfect spirals, like someone had stirred it with a giant spoon. Ice doesn't do that naturally. Ice doesn't form patterns. I pulled out my thermometer and took readings around the camp. 40 below, just like everywhere else. But when I held it over those spiral patterns, the needle dropped to 60 below. The air above those holes was 20 degrees colder than it should have been. That's when I heard it. A voice, carried on the wind. Help me. I looked around, but I was alone. Just me and the white emptiness of the lake. Help me, please. It sounded like it was coming from the forest, maybe 100 yards away. I grabbed my emergency pack and headed toward the sound. Maybe one of the brothers was hurt, hiding in the trees. But when I got to where I thought the voice had come from, there was nothing, just snow and pine trees, and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I was about to head back when I saw them. Tracks in the snow. But they weren't human tracks. They were huge, maybe 15 inches long and shaped like feet, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, and they pointed backward, like whatever made them was walking heel first. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward the Canadian border. I followed them for maybe 50 yards before I stopped. Something about those tracks made my skin crawl. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, telling me about things that walked on backward feet. I shook it off. Hypothermia makes you think crazy things. These were probably just moose tracks, distorted by the wind and snow. But as I walked back to the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. I set up my emergency shelter near the Kowalski camp and called in my position on the radio. The dispatcher told me 2 more rangers would be heading out in the morning to help with the search. Frank Miller and Joe Crane, both good men who knew the woods. That first night was the longest of my life. I'd camped in these woods hundreds of times, but something felt different. The usual forest sounds were gone. No owls hooting. No small animals rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed quieter, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard the voice again. Alina Itner, my name. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but snow and trees. But the voice came again, closer this time. Alina, help me. It sounded like Jake Kowalski. I'd met him a few times over the years, and the voice was right. But something was off about it. It was too clear, too calm for someone who'd been lost in this cold for days. Jake, where are you? Bye. The lake can't move. So cold. I grabbed my gear and headed toward the shore. My flashlight beam danced across the ice, but I didn't see anyone. The fishing holes were still there, still steaming in the cold air, like they were breathing. Jake, keep talking so I can find you. But the voice didn't answer. I called out, for 10 minutes, sweeping my light back and forth across the lake. Nothing. I was about to give up, when I saw something dark on the ice near the far shore, too big to be a rock, too still to be an animal. I started across the lake, testing each step. Ice fishing meant the lake was frozen solid, but you never take chances. The dark shape got bigger as I got closer. Then my light hit it, and I saw what it was. Pete Kowalski was lying face down on the ice, about 30 yards from shore. His winter coat was torn open, and there was blood in the snow around him. A lot of blood. I ran the last 20 yards, dropping to my knees beside him. He was frozen solid, had been dead for days. But that wasn't the worst part. Something had been eating him. His back was torn open, ribs showing white in my flashlight beam. Chunks of meat were missing from his arms and legs. But it wasn't like a bear attack or wolf kill. The cuts were too clean, too precise, like someone had used a knife and fork. I'd seen animal attacks before. This wasn't animals. I rolled him over, and that's when I saw his face. His mouth was open in a scream, and there were bite marks on his cheeks. Big ones. The teeth that made them had to be 4 inches long. My hands were shaking as I radioed it in. Base, this is Reeves. I found one of the missing fishermen, Pete Kowalski. He's dead. Copy that, Alina. What's the cause of death? Stared at the body, trying to find words that wouldn't make me sound crazy. Animal attack. I finally said, something big. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. No animal made bite marks like that. No animal ate people with that kind of precision. I was photographing the scene when I heard footsteps behind me, heavy steps, crunching through the snow. I spun around, flashlight raised. Who's there? The steps stopped. I played my light across the shore, but didn't see anything. Just trees and shadows. Jake, Mike, is that you? Nothing. I went back to documenting Pete's body, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness beyond my light. Every few minutes I'd spin around, but there was never anything there. It took me an hour to finish with the photos and measurements. The whole time, I kept hearing things. Footsteps in the snow, branches breaking. Once, I could have sworn I heard breathing, slow and deep, coming from right behind me. When I finally started back to shore, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were new tracks in the snow around Pete's body, the same backward footprints I'd seen at the camp. But these were fresh, made while I was working. Whatever killed Pete Kowalski had been watching me the whole time. I made it back to my tent and zipped it shut, but I didn't sleep. I sat with my back to the tent wall, rifle across my knees, listening to the night. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like something moving. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Jake's voice again. Alina, I'm so hungry. This time, I didn't answer. This time, I knew it wasn't really Jake talking, because Jake's voice was coming from right outside my tent. Frank and Joe showed up just after sunrise, their snowmobiles loud in the morning quiet. I'd never been so happy to see anyone in my life. You look like hell, Frank said, pulling off his helmet. He was an older guy, maybe 50, with grey hair and kind eyes. Rough night. I told them about finding Pete's body, but I left out the weird parts. The backward tracks, the voices, the feeling of being watched. Frank was practical. Joe was young and eager. Neither would believe me. Could be a bear, Joe suggested. They don't always hibernate when it gets this cold. Frank shook his head. Bears don't hunt on lake ice. And they sure don't drag bodies around. We spent the morning searching the area around Pete's body. Frank took more photos while Joe and I looked for tracks. The backward prints were still there in the snow, but now there were others too. Human prints leading from the shore into the forest. These look fresh, Joe said, kneeling beside them. Maybe one of the other brothers. The tracks were easy to follow in the deep snow. They led us about half a mile into the woods, to a small clearing, where the trees opened up. That's where we found Jake Kowalski. He was alive, but barely, sitting with his back against a pine tree, staring straight ahead, with eyes that didn't blink. His lips were blue, and there were ice crystals in his beard. He'd been sitting there for hours. Jake, I called, approaching slowly. Jake, can you hear me? He turned his head toward me, and I saw his mouth. It was stained with blood, fresh blood. So hungry, he whispered, so cold and hungry. Frank was already on the radio, calling for a medical evacuation. Joe was checking Jake's pulse, looking for signs of frostbite. But I was staring at Jake's fingernails. They were broken and bloody, like he'd been clawing at something. Jake, where's your brother Mike? Jake smiled, and I saw that his teeth were red. Mike kept me warm, he said. Mike tasted good. Frank and Joe looked at each other. Joe stepped back from Jake like he was contagious. Hypothermia, Frank said quietly, makes people say crazy things. But I was looking past Jake, into the trees behind him. There was something hanging from a branch about 20 feet away, something that looked like clothes. I walked over for a closer look, and my stomach turned over. It was Mike Kowalski, or what was left of him. He was hanging upside down from a pine branch 30 feet off the ground, his body frozen solid. His winter coat was gone, and most of his chest was torn open. But it was impossible. There was no way to get a body up that high. The tree had no low branches, nothing you could climb. It was like someone had thrown him up there. "Frank," I called, "you need to see this." Frank took one look and started throwing up in the snow. Joe just stood there with his mouth open. "How did he get up there?" Joe whispered. I didn't have an answer, but as I stared up at Mike's body, I noticed something else. The branches around him were arranged in a pattern, a perfect circle, like someone had twisted them into position. "We need to get Jake out of here," Frank said, wiping his mouth. "Get him to a hospital." But when we turned around, Jake was gone. The tree he'd been leaning against was there. The depression in the snow where he'd been sitting was there. But Jake Kowalski had vanished. Where did he go? Joe spun around, looking in all directions. He was right here. I found his tracks leading away from the tree, but they weren't normal footprints anymore. They were the same backward tracks I'd been seeing, like Jake's feet had turned around while we weren't looking. "This is wrong," I said, more to myself than the others. "This is all wrong." Frank was trying to stay calm, but I could hear the fear in his voice. People don't just disappear. He's injured and confused. He can't have gone far. We followed Jake's tracks deeper into the forest. They led us in a wide circle, always staying just out of sight. Every few hundred yards, we'd find signs that he'd stopped. A broken branch, a handful of snow disturbed. Once, we found blood in the snow, still warm. "Jake," Frank called out, "we're here to help you. Just come out and talk to us." That's when we heard the answer, but it wasn't coming from ahead of us on the trail. It was coming from behind us, back toward the camp. "Help me," Jake's voice called. "I'm so hungry." We looked at each other. If Jake was behind us, whose tracks were we? Following Joe was the first to break. "I don't like this," he said. "Something's not right here." I was about to agree when Frank's radio crackled to life. Bass to Miller. "Come in, Frank." Frank grabbed his radio. "Miller here." "Frank, we just got a call from the Kowalski family. Jake showed up at their house an hour ago. He's alive, but he's in bad shape. They're taking him to the hospital now." Frank stared at the radio like it was speaking Chinese. "That's impossible. Jake's here in the woods with us." "Negative, Frank. Jake Kowalski is at Duluth General Hospital. Has been for the last hour." Frank looked at me, then at Joe. If Jake was at the hospital, who had we been talking to in the clearing? That's when Joe screamed. I spun around to see him pointing at the trees behind us. Something was moving between the trunks, keeping pace with us but staying in the shadows. Something tall and thin that moved wrong, like its joints bent the wrong way. "What is that?" Joe whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I knew what it was. My grandmother's stories came flooding back. The Wendigo, the winter hunger, the thing that walks on backward feet and wears the faces of the dead. Frank pulled out his sidearm. "Who's there? Show yourself." The thing in the trees stopped moving. For a moment, everything was quiet except for our breathing and the wind through the pines. Then it spoke, and its voice was Jake's voice, but wrong, too deep, too hungry. "I'm so cold," it said, "so hungry. Why won't you feed me?" That's when it stepped out of the trees, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was 15 feet tall and thin as a skeleton. Its skin was white as snow and covered with frost. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, and its face was Jake Kowalski's face, but stretched and distorted like it was made of rubber. But the worst part was its mouth. When it smiled, I saw rows of yellow teeth, each one 4 inches long and sharp as knives. "Run," I whispered. Then I was screaming it. "Run." We ran through the forest like the devil was behind us, which maybe he was. I could hear it following, crashing through the trees like a freight train. But when I looked back, all I saw were shadows and snow. The thing moved too fast, appearing and disappearing between the trees like it was made of smoke. Frank was in the lead, Joe right behind him. I brought up the rear, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The sounds were getting closer. breaking branches, heavy footsteps, and underneath it all, Jake's voice calling to us. Don't run from me. I just want to share. I just want you to understand how hungry I am. We made it back to the camp, but our snowmobiles wouldn't start. The engines were frozen solid, even though we'd left them running. The fuel lines were clogged with ice crystals that looked like tiny spirals. The radio, Frank gasped, diving for the emergency kit. We need to call for help. But when he tried the radio, all we got was static. And underneath the static, we could hear whispers. Voices speaking in a language I recognized but couldn't understand. My grandmother's language, Ojibwe words about hunger and winter and things that should stay buried. It's cut us off, I said. Whatever it is, it doesn't want us talking to the outside world. Joe was standing by the tent, rifle in his hands. This is crazy. This is impossible. My grandmother used to tell stories, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, about things that lived in the deep woods. Wendigo, she called them, giants that ate people during the hardest winters. Frank looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Alina, that's just folklore. This is some kind of animal, or maybe a person in a costume. That's when the thing spoke from right outside our camp. I'm not folklore, Frank. Its voice was different now. Not Jake's anymore. It sounded like wind through dead trees. I was a man once, Thomas Kellner from the railroad camp up north, winter of 1889. We got snowed in for 3 months, and the food ran out in January. I could see it now, standing at the edge of the firelight, 15 feet tall and pale as bone, with those terrible yellow teeth. I held out longer than the others, watched them die one by one. But when my son stopped breathing, when little Tommy froze in his sleep, I couldn't bear it anymore. Frank raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking too bad to aim. I ate him. First, my own boy, and once I started eating, I couldn't stop. The hunger took over, became everything. Now I am the hunger. I am winter itself. Joe fired his rifle, and the bullet passed right through the thing like it was made of mist. The Wendigo laughed, and the sound made the ice on the lake crack. You can't kill hunger, it said, stepping closer. You can't shoot winter. I remembered something my grandmother had told me back when I was a kid, about tobacco and sage and prayers that could hold back the dark spirits. I'd always thought they were just stories, but now I wished I'd paid more attention. The Wendigo reached out with one impossibly long arm and grabbed Joe around the chest. He screamed as those yellow claws dug into his jacket. Let him go, Frank shouted, firing his rifle again and again. But the bullets did nothing. Joe was lifted off his feet, kicking and screaming, and then the Wendigo bit him. Those 4-inch teeth sank into Joe's shoulder, and blood sprayed across the snow. Joe's screams cut off suddenly. His body went limp, and when the Wendigo pulled its head back, Joe's eyes were different, hungry, like the thing had passed some kind of infection into him with its bite. Now you understand, the Wendigo said, dropping Joe to the ground. Now you know what real hunger feels like. Joe got to his feet slowly, and when he looked at us, I saw those same yellow teeth growing in his mouth. I'm so hungry, Joe whispered. Frank, you look delicious. Frank backed away, but Joe was faster. The hunger had made him strong, given him speed he'd never had before. He tackled Frank to the ground, and I heard Frank scream as Joe's new teeth found his throat. I ran into the tent and grabbed my emergency pack. Somewhere inside, I had a small pouch my grandmother had given me years ago. Sacred tobacco and sage, blessed by the tribal elders. I'd carried it as a good luck charm, never thinking I'd actually need it. Outside, Joe was feeding on Frank, and the Wendigo was watching with approval, like a proud parent teaching its child to hunt. I found the pouch and pulled out a handful of the sacred herbs. They were old and dry, but when I held them, they felt warm in my palm. Grandmother, I whispered in Ojibwe, using words I hadn't spoken since I was a child. Help me fight the winter hunger. The Wendigo turned toward me, and its smile faded when it saw what I was holding. That won't work, it said, but I heard uncertainty in its voice. The old ways are dead. The old protections are gone. I started to pray, speaking the words my grandmother had taught me. Words about balance and respect and keeping the hungry spirits at bay. As I spoke, the tobacco and sage began to glow with a soft light. The Wendigo hissed and stepped backward. Where the light touched it, its skin began to smoke. You cannot stop me, it snarled. I am winter eternal. I am the hunger that never dies. but it was backing away, keeping its distance from the glowing herbs in my hand. Joe looked up from Frank's body, his mouth red with blood. "Alina, why won't you join us? Why won't you understand?" I threw the tobacco and sage in a circle around myself, and the herbs burst into flame as they hit the ground. The fire was cold and white, but it burned bright enough to light up the whole camp. The Wendigo screamed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. Within the circle of sacred fire, I was safe, but I knew it wouldn't last long. The herbs were old, and there weren't many of them. "You're just delaying the inevitable," the Wendigo said, pacing around the circle like a caged animal. "When the fire dies, you'll be mine, and then you'll know what real hunger feels like." I had maybe 5 minutes before the herbs burned out, completely. 5 minutes to figure out how to destroy something that was already dead. That's when I remembered the rest of my grandmother's story. The Wendigo wasn't truly immortal. It could be stopped, but only by someone who understood its true nature. Someone who could see past the monster to the man it used to be. "Thomas Kellner," I called out. "That was your name, wasn't it? You had a son named Tommy." The Wendigo stopped pacing. "Don't speak of him. He died in the winter of 1889. You were just trying to survive. You didn't want to become this thing. Stop talking." The Wendigo's voice was changing, becoming more human, more sad than angry. "You've been hungry for almost 100 years, but it's not food you're hungry for, is it? It's forgiveness." The Wendigo fell to its knees outside my circle of fire. When it looked up at me, its eyes were human eyes, tired and full of pain. "I ate my own son," it whispered. "What kind of father does that? What kind of man?" "A desperate one," I said. "A man who'd been pushed past his breaking point." The sacred fire was getting dimmer. I had maybe 2 minutes left. "Thomas, you can let go now. You can stop being hungry. Tommy forgives you." The Wendigo looked up at me with hope in its terrible eyes. "How do you know?" "Because children always forgive their parents, even when their parents can't forgive themselves." The sacred fire flickered and went out, but the Wendigo didn't move. It stayed on its knees in the snow, and slowly, its form began to change. The pale skin became normal flesh. The yellow teeth became white. The 15-foot frame shrank down to the size of a man. For just a moment, I saw him as he'd been in life. Thomas Kellner, railroad worker, father, just a man trying to survive an impossible winter. Then the wind picked up, and he crumbled too. Dust. The dust scattered across the snow and was gone. Joe collapsed beside Frank's body. The hungry light faded from his eyes, and his teeth went back to normal. But Frank was dead. The Wendigo's hunger had claimed one more victim before the end. The rescue team found me 2 days later, half frozen and barely conscious. Joe was alive but in bad shape, with no memory of what had happened after we found Mike's body in the tree. The doctors said it was severe hypothermia, that his brain had shut down to preserve itself. I told them the official story. We'd been attacked by a large predator, possibly a bear driven mad by hunger. Frank had been killed in the attack. The Kowalski brothers had died of exposure and animal predation. It was a tragic accident, but these things happened in the wilderness. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wanted to dig deeper into something that didn't make sense. But I knew the truth, and I knew it wasn't over. 3 months later, I was back on duty. The Forest Service had offered me a transfer to a warmer climate, but I turned it down. These woods were my responsibility now. My grandmother had always said the old spirits chose their guardians, and I guess I'd been chosen. I started carrying the sacred tobacco and sage again. Fresh supplies from the reservation, blessed by the tribal elders who remembered the old stories, just in case. Because even though Thomas Kellner was at rest, the hunger he'd awakened was still out there. I could feel it in the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the temperature dropped below 30. A restless presence, looking for someone desperate enough to listen to its whispers. The missing persons report started again the next winter. Hunters and campers who went into the deep woods and never came back. Always during the coldest spells, always when the snow was deepest. I investigated every one. Most were just accidents, people who got lost or fell through thin ice. But some were different. Some had that wrongness about them that I'd learned to recognize. The spiral patterns in the ice, the backward tracks in the snow, the feeling of being watched by hungry eyes. I became the liaison between the Forest Service and the Ojibwe Nation, helping to establish new safety protocols for the winter months. Officially, it was about preventing hypothermia and animal attacks. Unofficially, it was about keeping the old protections alive. Jake Kowalski recovered physically, but he never came back to the woods. He moved to Florida and got a job in construction. He sends me a Christmas card every year, and every year he writes the same thing. Thank you for bringing me home. He doesn't remember what happened to him out there, and that's probably for the best. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry, but I remember every detail of those 3 days when winter showed me its true face. And I remember the lesson my grandmother tried to teach me when I was young. Respect the wilderness, because it's older and stronger than you'll ever be. The Wendigo Thomas Kellner created was gone, but the hunger itself was eternal. It would find new hosts, new vessels for its endless need. That's the way it had always been, since the first human discovered that survival sometimes meant doing the unthinkable. My job now was to stand guard, to watch for the signs and be ready when the hunger stirred again, to carry the sacred fire that could hold back the darkness, at least for a little while, because winter always comes back. And when it does, something comes with it, something that walks on backward feet and wears the faces of the dead, something that's always hungry. I keep the tobacco and sage close, and I listen to the wind. And when the temperature drops and the snow begins to fall, I remember Thomas Kellner's words, "You can't kill hunger. You can't shoot winter, but you can stand against it. You can hold the line, at least until spring comes again." My name is Thomas Everett, and I've been a ranger at Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri for 16 years. I've seen bears attack campers, pulled bodies from rivers, and dealt with poachers who'd shoot anything that moved. I thought I knew every danger these woods could throw at me. I was wrong. It was August 1985, the hottest summer anyone could remember. The trees were dying from the heat, and even the streams had slowed to a trickle. I'd been working double shifts because 2 other rangers had quit that month. The stress was getting to me, and my ex-wife Sarah kept threatening to take my boys away if I didn't find a safer job. She said the forest was making me crazy. Maybe she was right. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A family camping at Rocky Falls hadn't checked in with friends like they promised. The friend drove out to look for them and found their campsite still set up, but no sign of the Reynolds family anywhere. I drove out there with my partner Jim Morrison, the station chief. Jim was close to retirement and had seen everything these woods had to offer. When we got to the campsite, even he went quiet. The tent was still standing, but something was very wrong. The campfire had been put out carefully, not just stamped down like people usually do. Their food was still in the cooler, untouched. Their car keys were on the picnic table. "Where are they?" Jim asked, walking around the site. That's when I saw the first tracks. They looked like dog prints, but bigger, much bigger, and they walked in a straight line, like a person would walk. I knelt down and measured one with my hand. It was nearly as long as my palm. "Jim, come look at this." He crouched next to me and stared at the print. "That's not right," he said. "Dogs don't walk like that." We followed the tracks for about 50 yards before they disappeared into the rocky creek bed. But we found something else that made my blood run cold. There were at least 6 different sets of tracks, all the same weird dog-like shape, all walking upright, and they had surrounded the campsite before moving in. "This was planned," I said, not really believing my own words. Jim looked at me like I was crazy. "What do you mean, planned? Animals don't plan attacks." But I was already seeing it in my head. The way the tracks moved around the camp first, like they were watching. The way the fire had been put out so carefully. The way there was no sign of a struggle, like the family had been taken by surprise in the dark. We called in a search team and spent 3 days looking for the Reynolds family. We found pieces of their clothes near the cave system about 2 miles from the campsite. We found blood on the rocks, but we never found them. The official report said they probably fell into one of the deep caves and couldn't get out. Jim signed off on it, and the case was closed. But I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. And I couldn't stop thinking about how the local Cherokee families wouldn't come near that part of the forest. They called it the Wolf People's Land and said their grandparents had warned them to stay away. I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. Livestock getting killed in ways that didn't make sense. Hikers going missing during full moon weeks. Strange howls that didn't sound like any wolf I'd ever heard. My boys, Tommy Jr. and Mike, were coming to visit that weekend. They were 8 and 10, and they loved camping with their dad. I always took them to the same spot near Corinth River, where the water was still running clear and cool. Sarah called the night before they were supposed to come. "Tom, I'm worried about you," she said. "Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store said you've been asking weird questions about missing people and animal attacks. People are starting to talk. I'm just doing my job, Sarah. Your job is to check on campers and give out trail maps, not to chase ghost stories. The boys aren't coming this weekend. I think you need some time to figure out what's important to you." She hung up before I could argue. I sat in my empty cabin that night, listening to the sounds of the forest. Usually, those sounds comforted me. The owls calling, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the distant splash of fish jumping in the river. But that night, everything sounded different, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I got up and checked the locks on my doors twice before I went to bed. For the first time in 16 years, I was afraid of my own forest. 3 weeks later, another family went missing. The Hendersons were experienced campers who came to the forest every summer. They knew the rules, stayed on marked trails, and always checked in with the ranger station. When they didn't show up for their scheduled check-in, I knew something was wrong. I drove out to their campsite with Michelle Torres, a ranger who'd transferred in from Arkansas. She was tough, smart, and had more experience tracking animals than anyone else in the district. "Tell me about the Reynolds case," she said as we drove through the forest. I told her about the tracks, the way the campsite looked, the strange behavior of the local families. She listened without interrupting. "You think something killed them," she said. "It wasn't a question. I think something hunted them." When we got to the Henderson campsite, I felt sick. It was exactly the same as before. Tents still standing, fire carefully put out, food untouched. But this time, there were drag marks leading away from the site. And this time, there was blood. Michelle knelt next to the dark stains in the dirt. "This is fresh, maybe 6 hours old." The drag marks led toward the same cave system where we'd found pieces of the Reynolds family's clothes. But these tracks were different, clearer, like whoever made them wanted us to follow. "Tom," Michelle said, pointing to the ground. "Look at this." Next to the drag marks were the same upright dog tracks I'd seen before, but these were deeper, more defined, and there were claw marks scraped into the dirt in a pattern that looked almost like writing. We followed the trail for a quarter mile before it disappeared into the rocky ground near the caves. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. "We should call for backup," Michelle said. I was about to agree when we heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl. It started as a low howl, like a wolf calling to its pack, but then it changed, got higher, almost like a person screaming. It was coming from inside the cave system. "That's human," Michelle whispered. We both drew our guns and moved toward the cave entrance. The howling sound came again, closer this time, and I swear it sounded like it was saying words. "Help, me, Michelle looked at me. "Someone's alive in there." We had flashlights and radios, but the cave system went deep into the mountain. We could get lost for days in there. The smart thing would be to call for a rescue team and wait, but that voice was calling for help. We went in. The caves were bigger than I expected, with passages that split off in every direction. Our flashlights created weird shadows on the walls, and every sound echoed strangely. We followed the main passage, calling out to whoever was asking for help. After about 10 minutes, we found them. The Henderson family was alive, but they were tied up with rope made from strips of their own clothes. Mr. Henderson had a head wound that was still bleeding. Mrs. Henderson and their teenage daughter were unconscious, but breathing. "Thank God," Michelle said, rushing toward them. But Mr. Henderson looked at us with pure terror in his eyes. "No," he whispered. "It's a trap. They're still here." There. That's when the lights went out. Not our flashlights. Those were still working. But somewhere deeper in the cave, there had been other lights. Electric lights. And now they were gone. And the cave was filled with the sound of something big, moving in the darkness. "We need to go. Now," I said, cutting the ropes that held the family. Mr. Henderson grabbed my arm. "They walk like people," he said. "But they're not people. They've been keeping us here for days, bringing us food, like we're pets." A howl echoed through the cave, and this time I could tell it was coming from something that had human vocal cords but wasn't human anymore. We got the family moving, with me and Michelle covering the rear. Mrs. Henderson and the daughter were weak but could walk. Mr. Henderson kept looking over his shoulder and whispering, "They're coming, they're coming." We were maybe 50 yards from the cave entrance when we saw the eyes, yellow eyes, reflecting our flashlight beams, watching us from the shadows. At first I thought it was just one animal, but then I realized there were multiple sets of eyes. They were surrounding us. "Keep moving," I told the family. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." One of the creatures stepped into our light. I'll never forget what I saw. It was roughly the size and shape of a man, but covered in dark fur. Its face was long like a wolf's, with teeth that caught the light, but its eyes were intelligent, almost human, and it was standing on two legs, wearing the torn remains of what looked like hiking clothes. It tilted its head and looked right at me. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in a voice that was part growl, part human speech. Michelle screamed. The creature lunged at us, and I fired 3 shots center mass. The bullets hit it, but it barely slowed down. It knocked me flat and stood over me, its claws digging into my chest. "The pack is growing," it said. "Soon, you'll understand." Then Michelle hit it with her flashlight, and it backed off long enough for us to run. We made it out of the cave with the Henderson family. We got them to the hospital. We filed our reports, but I couldn't stop thinking about what the creature had said. The pack is growing, and I couldn't stop thinking about how it had been wearing human clothes. The next 2 weeks were hell. The Henderson family recovered, but they wouldn't talk about what happened in the cave. Every time someone asked, they'd get this look in their eyes like they were seeing something terrible, and they'd clam up. Mr. Henderson pulled me aside when I visited them at the hospital. "That thing that talked to us," he said. "It used to be human. It told us its name was David McCready. Said he went missing 2 years ago." I knew that name. David McCready was a hiker who disappeared in 1983. We'd found his torn clothes and some blood, and figured a bear had gotten him. The case was closed. "He's their leader now," Mr. Henderson continued. "He told us about the pack, how they choose people to join them. He said we were lucky they picked us for something special." "What do you mean, special?" Henderson's hands were shaking. "He said they were going to turn us into what they are, that the full moon was coming, and then we'd understand everything." I felt cold all over. "When's the next full moon?" 3 days. I went straight to the station and pulled every missing person file from the last 5 years. The pattern was clear once I knew what to look for. People disappeared in groups of 3 or 4, always during the week before a full moon. Their campsites were always found undisturbed, like they'd just vanished, and it was getting worse. The disappearances were happening more often, and covering a wider area. I showed the files to Michelle. She studied them for a long time. "It's like they're expanding their territory," she said, "or growing their pack." We decided to stake out the area around the caves during the full moon. If these things were planning something, we wanted to be ready. Jim Morrison thought we were crazy. "You're talking about werewolves," he said. "This is Missouri, not some horror movie." "Then explain the Henderson family," Michelle said. "Explain the tracks. Explain how a missing hiker from 1983 is somehow still alive and leading a pack of whatever these things are." Jim didn't have an answer for that. We set up surveillance equipment near the cave entrance and took shifts watching. The first night was quiet. The second night, we heard howling in the distance, but nothing came near the caves. On the third night, the night of the full moon, they came for us. I was on watch when I saw them moving through the trees. 7 shapes, walking upright, but moving with an animal's grace. They knew we were there. I could tell by the way they approached our position, spreading out to surround us. I radioed Michelle, who was sleeping in the truck about 100 yards away. "They're here," I whispered. The radio crackled with static, then went dead. The largest of the creatures stepped into the moonlight, where I could see it clearly. It was the same one from the cave, the one that had spoken to me. David McCready, or what he'd become. "Thomas Everett," it said, and my blood went cold. "It knew my name. You've been watching us," it continued, "learning about us. That shows intelligence. That shows you might be worth keeping." I gripped my rifle tighter. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand. We're not monsters. We're evolved. We're what humans could become if they stopped being weak." More of the creatures moved out of the shadows. Up close, I could see that they'd all been human once. Their faces still had human features mixed with wolf characteristics. They wore scraps of clothing, jewelry, things from their old lives. "The woman with you," McCready said. "Where is she?" I didn't answer, but I heard Michelle scream from the direction of the truck. "Ah, McCready smiled, showing teeth like broken glass. My pack is efficient. I raised my rifle, but 3 of the creatures were already behind me. One of them knocked the gun from my hands with casual ease. You have a choice, Thomas, McCready said. You can join us willingly, and keep your mind, your memories, your sense of self. Or you can fight us, and we'll take you anyway, but you'll lose everything that makes you who you are. I'll never be like you. McCready laughed, a sound like breaking branches. Everyone says that, but when the change begins, when you feel the power flowing through you, when you can smell fear from miles away and hear heartbeats in the darkness, you'll understand why we chose this. He gestured to his pack. We were all like you once, scared, weak, human. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the smaller creatures was wearing a ranger uniform, a name tag that read M. Torres. Michelle, I whispered. The creature that had been my partner turned to look at me. Her face was already changing, becoming longer, more wolf-like, but her eyes were still human, still aware. I'm sorry, Tom, she said in a voice that was barely recognizable. It doesn't hurt as much as you think it will. McCready nodded approvingly. She's adapting quickly. The change works faster on some people than others. By tomorrow night, she'll be fully transformed. He walked closer to me. Your turn. The other pack members grabbed my arms. I struggled, but they were impossibly strong. Wait, I said desperately. You said I had a choice. You said I could keep my mind if I joined willingly. McCready paused. You're willing. I want to know more first. I want to understand what you're offering. It was a lie, but it bought me time to think. McCready smiled again. Smart, very smart. That's exactly why we chose you. He began to pace around me like a teacher giving a lecture. We're not random killers, Thomas. We're selective. We study potential pack members for months before we approach them. We learn about their lives, their families, their weaknesses. My blood went cold. My sons Tommy Jr. and Mike, 8 and 10 years old. They love camping with their father. They have no idea how dangerous the woods can be. I lunged at him, but the others held me back. Your ex-wife is right to be concerned. McCready continued calmly. This job is dangerous, but not in the way she thinks. The danger isn't to you. It's to everyone you care about. He leaned in close. Join us, and your family is safe. We protect our own. Fight us, and we'll visit them next. That's when I made my decision. I pretended to give in. Okay, I said, letting my shoulders sag in defeat. Okay, I'll do it. But I want to see Michelle first. I want to make sure she's all right. McCready studied my face for a long moment. Then he nodded to the others, and they released my arms. Of course, pack loyalty is important. He led me toward the cave entrance, with the other creatures following. Michelle was there, sitting on the ground with her back against the rock wall. The change was happening fast. Her hands had become claws, and her face was stretched into something between human and wolf. Tom, she said when she saw me, don't let them do this to you. It's too late for warnings, McCready said. He's already made his choice. But Michelle caught my eye and glanced down at her belt. Her emergency flare was still there, hidden under her jacket. Fire. I remembered reading that wolves were afraid of fire. I want to understand the process, I said to McCready. How does the change work? He was happy to explain. The transformation took 3 days during a full moon cycle. First, the enhanced senses, then the physical changes, then finally the mental shift that would make me part of the pack. The beauty of it, he said, is that you'll remember choosing this. You'll remember being human, but you won't care. You'll understand that this is better. While he talked, I slowly worked my way closer to Michelle. The other pack members were relaxed now, thinking I'd given up. What about my job, my life? You'll disappear, McCready said. Another missing person case. Your ex-wife will get a call saying you never came back from patrol. Eventually, they'll find some torn clothes and blood, and everyone will assume you had an accident. And then you help us grow the pack. You know these woods better than anyone. You know which campers to target, which families are isolated, which areas the other rangers don't patrol regularly. That's when I grabbed Michelle's flare. I pulled the pin and fired it directly into McCready's chest. The magnesium burned white-hot against his fur, and he screamed like nothing I'd ever heard. The other pack members lunged at me, but I had Michelle's whole belt of emergency equipment. I fired 3 more flares in quick succession, and suddenly, the cave entrance was full of burning light and smoke. The creatures couldn't handle it. They backed away, covering their eyes and howling in pain. "The fire!" Michelle shouted, still mostly human. "They can't stand the fire." I grabbed her, and we ran for the cave entrance. Behind us, McCready was roaring orders to his pack, but they were confused and scattered by the flames. We made it outside, but I knew they'd follow us once the flares burned out. We needed to get to the truck and get help, but the truck wouldn't start. They'd sabotaged it while we were in the cave. "The radio," Michelle said. Her voice was getting more strained. As the change continued, "Call for backup." I tried, but got only static. We were on our own. That's when I remembered the emergency supply cache hidden in the ranger station about 2 miles away. It had more flares, a satellite phone, and other equipment we could use. "Can you make it that far?" I asked Michelle. She nodded, but I could see it was getting harder for her to think clearly. We started running through the forest, following trails I'd known since I was a kid. Behind us, I could hear the pack howling as they picked up our scent. They were faster than us, and they knew these woods almost as well as I did. But I had one advantage. I knew about the old fire roads that the Forestry Service had cut years ago. They were grown over now, but still passable if you knew where to look. We made it about a mile before they caught up with us. McCready appeared out of the darkness ahead of us, blocking our path. His chest was still burned from the flare, but he was already healing. "That was clever," he said. "But now you've made me angry." The rest of the pack surrounded us. In the moonlight, they looked like something out of a nightmare. But I noticed something important. They were keeping their distance from me, because I still had 2 flares left. "Michelle," I said quietly, "when I give the signal, run for the ranger station. Don't look back. I can't leave you. You're still changing. If you stay human long enough, maybe we can find a way to reverse it." McCready laughed. "There is no reversing it. She's already one of us. Look at her hands." Michelle's claws had grown longer, and fur was spreading up her arms. "Fight it," I told her. "Remember who you are." That seemed to anger McCready more than anything. "She doesn't want to fight it. Tell him, Michelle. Tell him how good it feels." Michelle looked at me with eyes that were already starting to turn yellow. "Tom," she said, and her voice was barely human now. "I can hear everything. Every heartbeat, every breath, every insect in the forest, and I'm not afraid anymore." She turned to face McCready. "I want to hunt." My heart broke. I'd lost her, but I still had the flares. I fired both of them at the same time, one at McCready and one at the ground between us. The sudden explosion of light and heat scattered the pack again, and I ran for the station. I could hear them following me, crashing through the underbrush like a pack of real wolves. But the fire had given me enough of a head start. I made it to the ranger station and barricaded myself inside. The satellite phone worked, and I called for backup, but the nearest help was hours away. The pack surrounded the building and began testing the doors and windows. I could see their shapes moving in the darkness outside. Then McCready's voice came from right outside the main door. "Thomas, you're only delaying the inevitable. We have all night, and tomorrow night, and the night after that. Eventually, you'll have to come out." "Maybe," I said. "But I've got something you don't." "What's that?" I held up a can of gasoline from the emergency supplies. "Insurance." There was silence from outside. "You'll burn yourself alive before you'll join us." "If I have to." Another long pause. Then McCready spoke again, but his voice was different, more human. "You know, Thomas, I wasn't always like this. I used to be like you. I had a family, a job, a normal life. What happened? I got lost in these woods during a camping trip. The pack found me half dead from exposure and fear. They gave me a choice: die as a human or live as something more. So you chose this. I chose survival and power and freedom from all the small, stupid concerns that make human life so miserable." I could hear him moving around the building, testing for weak points. "Your ex-wife is right. You know," he continued, "this job is killing you. The stress, the isolation, the things you see out here. How long before you break down completely?" He was right, and that scared me more than anything else. "We can smell your fear, Thomas. We can smell your loneliness. You don't have to be alone anymore." That's when I realized something. The pack wasn't just hunting me. They were trying to convert me, even now. Everything McCready was saying was designed to make me doubt myself, to make joining them seem like the reasonable choice. I poured gasoline around the inside of the station and lit a match. One step closer, and I drop it. I called out. The noises outside stopped. "You're bluffing." try me. Dawn was still hours away, but I only had to hold them off until backup arrived. I could hear helicopters in the distance, getting closer. That's when Michelle appeared at the window. She was fully transformed now, but something in her eyes was still human. Still my partner. Tom, she said. Let me in. I can't do that. I'm still me. I'm still Michelle. I just evolved. The Michelle I knew wouldn't hunt innocent people. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the Michelle you knew was weak. She was afraid of everything. I'm not afraid anymore. Being afraid isn't weakness. Being afraid is what keeps us human. She stared at me through the glass, and for a second I saw a flicker of the person she used to be. I'm sorry, she whispered. Then she stepped back into the darkness. The helicopters were getting closer. McCready called out one last time. This isn't over. Thomas, we know where you live. We know where your sons go to school. We know your routines, your habits, your weaknesses. Then you know I'll be ready for you. Will you? Will you be ready when we come for your family? Will your flares and gasoline be enough to protect them? The search helicopters appeared over the tree line, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. The pack melted away into the forest like shadows. But I could hear McCready's voice one last time, carried on the wind. We'll be waiting. The official report said that Ranger Michelle Torres was killed by a rabid wolf pack during a routine patrol. Her body was never found, but there was enough blood evidence to close the case. I was treated for shock and minor injuries, then given 2 weeks of administrative leave. The department wanted to transfer me to a desk job in Jefferson City, but I requested a transfer to Colorado instead. I wanted to get as far away from Missouri as possible. Sarah was surprisingly supportive when I called to tell her about the transfer. Maybe she could hear something different in my voice, something that told her I wasn't the same person who'd left for work that morning. Will you be safe in Colorado? She asked. Safer than here. The boys miss you. Maybe this is a chance for a fresh start. I wanted to believe that, but every night I checked the locks on my doors twice. Every shadow in the forest looked like it might be hiding yellow eyes. Every howl in the distance made me reach for the emergency flare I now carried everywhere, because I knew McCready hadn't been bluffing. The pack was still out there, still growing, still hunting. 3 months after I moved to Colorado, I got a call from Jim Morrison. 5 more people had gone missing from Mark Twain National Forest during the full moon. Their campsites showed the same signs: carefully extinguished fires, undisturbed belongings, and those impossible tracks leading toward the cave system. I should have listened to you, Jim said. I should have done something. There was nothing you could do. There still isn't. What am I supposed to tell the families? I didn't have an answer for that. 6 months later, Jim retired early and moved to Florida. He said he couldn't stand the forest anymore, couldn't stand the way it felt, like something was always watching from the shadows. I understood exactly what he meant. My new job in Colorado is good. I patrol ski areas and deal with lost hikers and minor emergencies. Normal ranger work. Human problems with human solutions. But I still carry emergency flares. I still check missing person reports from Missouri. And every full moon, I make sure my sons are safely inside, with all the doors locked and every light in the house turned on, because I know the pack is still growing. I know they're still recruiting. And I know that someday, McCready will make good on his promise. Sarah got full custody of the boys after the transfer. She said I was too unstable to be a proper father. Maybe she's right. Maybe it's better if they stay far away from me and the things that hunt in the darkness. But sometimes, when I'm patrolling alone in the Colorado mountains, I hear howls that don't sound like any wolf I've ever known. I see tracks that are too big, too human-like. I find campsites that have been abandoned too cleanly, with fires that have been put out too carefully. And I know that the pack didn't stay in Missouri. They're spreading. Last week, I got a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about missing hikers in Arkansas, and a photo of a Forest Service ranger who'd disappeared during a search and rescue operation. The ranger's name was David Kim, but in the photo, I could see something familiar in his eyes, something that reminded me of Michelle in those last moments before she fully transformed. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written a message in handwriting I recognized. The pack remembers its friends. We'll see you soon, DM David McCready. I've started keeping a detailed journal of every strange incident I encounter, every unusual track I find, every report of missing people in the mountain states. I send copies to rangers in other states, disguised as routine communications about wildlife behavior. Most of them probably think I'm crazy, but some respond with their own stories, their own unexplained incidents, their own fears about things. Moving in the forest that shouldn't exist. We're building a network, a warning system. We're trying to track the pack's movements, to predict where they'll strike next. But I know it won't be enough. The pack is smarter than we are, more organized than we are. They're not just animals anymore. They're something new, something evolved for hunting humans, and they're patient. Sometimes I wonder if I should have made the other choice that night in the cave. If I should have joined them instead of fighting them. Michelle seemed happy, in her way, free from fear, free from doubt, free from the burden of human weakness. But then I think about my sons, about the families who've been torn apart by these creatures, about the rangers and campers and hikers who've died, or disappeared, or been transformed into something monstrous. And I know I made the right choice. Even if it means spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, even if it means never being able to enjoy the peace of the forest again, even if it means living with the knowledge that somewhere out there, in caves and abandoned buildings and deep wilderness areas, a pack of creatures that used to be human is growing stronger and more organized with each passing moon. There, still hunting, and someday they'll come for me. But when they do, I'll be ready. I have to be. Because I'm the only one who knows the truth about what's really stalking through America's forests. And I'm running out of flares. My name is Rebecca Thorne, and I've been a ranger in the Angeles National Forest for 9 years. Before that, I spent 3 years fighting fires in Los Angeles. I thought I'd seen everything that could go wrong in these mountains. I was wrong. It was September 1992. And the weather was all kinds of strange. Instead of the usual dry heat, cold fog rolled in from the coast every morning, making the pine trees look like ghosts. The marine layer was so thick you could barely see 20 feet ahead on the trails. Perfect conditions for people to get lost, which is exactly what started happening. I specialized in backcountry patrol, the deep wilderness areas where cell phones didn't work and help was hours away. Most of my job was pretty routine, checking on campers, helping lost hikers find their way back to the main trails, making sure people weren't doing anything stupid with campfires. The San Gabriel Mountains might be only 25 miles from downtown LA, but out here in the chaparral and pine forest, you could die just as easily as anywhere else. The weird thing was, I kept finding abandoned camps, not messy ones, where people had left in a hurry because of weather or wildlife. These were neat, organized camps where it looked like someone had just stepped away for a minute. Coffee still warm in the pot, sleeping bags laid out like people were planning to come back, but no people anywhere. I radioed it into headquarters each time, but my supervisor just told me to log it as abandoned property and move on. City folks get spooked easy, he said. They hear a coyote howl and suddenly they're running for their cars. But I knew the difference between spooked campers and something else. In my years fighting fires, I'd learned to trust my gut when something felt wrong, and everything about these abandoned camps felt wrong. The locals had stories, of course. Old-timers at the ranger station would talk about void walkers when they thought nobody was listening. Shadow people who existed between our world and somewhere else, stealing folks away into the darkness. I'd always figured that was just mountain folklore, the kind of stories people tell around campfires to scare each other. Then I started carrying an electromagnetic field detector. It was supposed to help identify areas where lightning might strike, but I noticed something strange. Every abandoned campsite showed massive M spikes, like someone had set off a huge electrical surge right in that spot. The readings didn't match anything in my training manual. What really got my attention was the electronics. Trail cameras would malfunction in certain areas, showing static or going completely black. Hikers complained that their radios picked up voices from decades ago, old country music, weather reports from the 1950s, conversations in languages nobody recognized. I started keeping detailed notes of every weird incident, the temperature drops that came out of nowhere, creating frost in 90-degree weather, the spots where compasses spun like crazy, pointing everywhere and nowhere, the places where my flashlight beam seemed to bend and twist, like the light itself was being pulled somewhere else. My partner at the station, James Hawthorne, thought I was losing it. He'd been ranging these mountains for 15 years and never seen anything he couldn't explain. "You're spending too much time alone out there, Becky," he'd say. "Your imagination's running wild." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was seeing patterns where there weren't any. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hunting in these woods, something that didn't leave tracks or scat, or any of the normal signs that predators do. I'd lost my entire fire crew 3 years earlier in a warehouse blaze in downtown LA. 7 good people died because I made the wrong call about when to evacuate. The guilt from that followed me up into these mountains, and maybe that's why I felt so responsible for every person who went missing out here. I couldn't save my crew, but maybe I could protect the hikers and campers who trusted these trails. The morning, everything changed. I was starting my patrol before dawn. The fog was so thick, I could barely see my own boots. My radio crackled with static, and for just a second, I heard what sounded like a woman's voice calling for help. But when I tried to respond, there was nothing but dead air. The call came in at 7:43 a.m. on September 15th. A man named David Mills was reporting his wife missing on the Eagle Rock Trail. I grabbed my gear and headed out, expecting another case of someone wandering off the marked path. David was waiting for me at the trailhead, pacing back and forth next to his Honda Civic. He was maybe 40 years old, wearing brand new hiking boots and a rain jacket that still had the tags on it. City folks, just like my supervisor had said. She was right behind me, he kept saying. We were talking about the weird fog, how it made everything look spooky. I heard her voice, and then I turned around, and she was gone. I'd heard this story before. People got separated in heavy fog all the time. How long ago was this, Mr. Mills? 20 minutes, maybe 30. I've been calling her name, but ... He trailed off, looking up at the fog-covered trees. There's something wrong with this place, the way the sound travels. It's like my voice just stops after a few feet. We started up the trail together. The fog was so thick it felt like walking through wet cotton. I could hear David breathing hard beside me, but I couldn't see him unless I turned my head directly toward him. "Janet," he called every few minutes. "Janet, where are you?" Nothing called back. About half a mile up the trail, we found her water bottle. It was sitting upright on a flat rock, cap screwed on tight, like someone had carefully placed it there. No sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the trail. "This is where we were walking," David said. "She was drinking from this bottle, and I made some joke about the fog looking like ghosts in the trees. She laughed and said something back, but I couldn't quite hear her over the wind. I knelt down and examined the ground around the rock. The soil was soft from the morning dew, perfect for holding tracks. I could see David's boot prints clearly, size 11 or so, with that distinctive waffle pattern that new hiking boots have, but I couldn't find any sign of his wife. "What size shoe does Janet wear?" I asked. 7.5. She's got those pink running shoes on, the ones with the white swoosh. I circled the rock 3 times, looking for any trace of a size 7.5. Pink running shoe. Nothing. It was like she'd just vanished into thin air. That's when David pulled out his camera. "I was taking pictures of the fog," he said. "You know, for the scrapbook. Let me see if I got anything." He flipped through the digital photos on the camera's tiny screen. Most of them showed the same thing, gray fog and dark tree shapes. But then he stopped at one particular image and went pale. "Look at this," he whispered. The photo showed the 2 of them on the trail, maybe 5 minutes before she disappeared. David was in the foreground, pointing at something off camera. Behind him, you could see a woman's figure in pink running shoes and a blue jacket. But where her face should have been, there was just a dark blur. "The camera must have malfunctioned," David said, but his voice was shaking. I took the camera and scrolled to the next photo. This one showed David alone on the trail, but there was something else. A shadow fell across the path behind him, a human-shaped shadow that didn't match any of the trees or rocks around us. It looked like someone was standing just out of frame, casting a shadow that bent and twisted in ways that didn't make sense. "When did you take this one?" I asked. "Right after Janet. Right after I realized she was gone. I was trying to get a picture of the area so I could show you exactly where we'd been standing." I stared at the image. The shadow was definitely human-shaped, but it seemed to be moving independently of any light source. In the photo, it looked like it was reaching toward David. That's when my radio crackled to life. Not with headquarters, but with something else, a woman's voice, faint and distant. "David, David, where are you? I can't find the trail. Everything looks the same. David grabbed the radio from my belt. Janet, is that you? Where are you? Static. Then, after a long pause, it's so dark here. The trees are different. They're not the same trees. Janet, stay where you are. We're coming to find you. Just keep talking so we can hear your voice. But the radio had gone dead. I tried switching channels, checking the battery, everything. Nothing but static. We need to call for backup, I told David, but when I tried to reach headquarters, my radio wouldn't transmit at all. The electronic display showed full battery and good signal strength, but no sound came through. That's when I noticed the temperature. It had been maybe 60 degrees when we started hiking, typical for a foggy morning. Now it felt like it was barely above freezing. I could see my breath, and frost was forming on the pine needles around us. Did you feel that? David asked. It just got really cold, really fast. I pulled out my electromagnetic field detector. The needle was jumping all over the place, showing readings that shouldn't have been possible in a natural environment. It was like standing next to a power line during a lightning storm. Mr. Mills, I said carefully, I think we need to head back to the parking area, right now. But when we turned around, the trail was gone. Where there should have been a clear path winding down through the trees, there was just more fog and forest. The trees seemed to stretch in all directions, identical and endless. That's impossible, David said. We came straight up this trail. It has to be here somewhere. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun lazily in circles, never settling on any particular direction. North, south, east, west. They all looked exactly the same. In the distance, barely audible through the fog, we heard Janet's voice again. David, I can see you. You're standing right there, but you can't see me. Why can't you see me? We both turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there but empty forest. I'd been a ranger long enough to know when a situation was going from bad to worse. David Mills was starting to panic, and I couldn't blame him. We'd been walking in circles for 2 hours, and the fog wasn't lifting like it should have by now. This is impossible, David kept saying. Trails don't just disappear. My wife doesn't just vanish into thin air. I'd radioed headquarters about the situation before we lost contact completely. Protocol said that if I didn't check in by noon, they'd send backup. But noon had come and gone, and we were still lost in what should have been familiar territory. That's when we heard the voices. Not Janet's voice this time. Multiple voices, coming from different directions. Men, women, even what sounded like children. All of them calling out names, asking for help, wondering where they were. But when we moved toward the sounds, they seemed to move away from us, always just out of sight in the fog. How many people are lost out here? David asked. I didn't answer, because I was starting to realize that these might not be lost people at all. Some of the voices were too faint, too distant, and some of them were speaking in ways that didn't sound quite right, like they were calling from very far away, or from a long time ago. My partner James found us around 3 in the afternoon. I heard him calling my name through the fog, and it was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. We followed his voice until we saw his familiar orange ranger jacket emerging from between the trees. Becky, thank God we've been looking for you for hours. What the hell happened to your radio? It stopped working. We got turned round in the fog, and we can't find the trail. I decided not to mention the electromagnetic readings or the strange voices. Not yet. James looked at David with the kind of professional sympathy he reserved for panicked civilians. Mr. Mills, I'm Ranger Hawthorne. We're going to find your wife. Okay, but first we need to get you both out of this fog. He led us down what looked like a deer path, moving with the confidence of someone who'd been navigating these mountains for 15 years. Within 20 minutes, we were back at the parking area. The fog was still thick up on the mountain, but down here the air was clear and warm. David Mills drove off to wait at the ranger station while James and I organized a proper search party. But as we were loading equipment into the truck, James pulled me aside. Becky, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Have you been experiencing any strange incidents ... up there? I looked at him carefully. James wasn't the kind of guy who believed in ghost stories. What do you mean? Missing time, electronic malfunctions, voices on the radio that shouldn't be there. He paused. Temperature drops that come out of nowhere. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You've experienced this, too. Last week, I was doing a routine patrol on the Wilson Trail when I lost 3 hours. 1 minute I was checking a campsite at 10 in the morning. The next minute I was standing in the middle of the forest at 1 in the afternoon with no memory of how I got there. James looked older than his 45 years, like he hadn't been sleeping well. That's not the weird part though. The weird part is what I found when I got back to the station. He pulled out a small notebook from his shirt pocket. I always log my patrol routes and times. But when I checked my notes from that day, I found entries that I didn't remember writing, times and locations that didn't match where I thought I'd been. He opened the notebook and showed me a page covered in his handwriting, but the writing looked strange, like it had been done by someone who was trying to copy his style but didn't quite get it right. 11:47 observe shadow movement, independent of light source. Grid 23, las 12:15 p.m. temperature drop, 30 degrees, lasted 4 minutes 12:33 p.m. Radio interference. Voices speaking in unidentified language, 12:58 p.m. Subject approached by unidentified figures. No visual confirmation possible. I don't remember writing any of this, James said. But it's my handwriting, in my notebook, with my pen. We spent the rest of the afternoon searching for Janet Mills. 8 rangers, to search and rescue dogs, and a helicopter when the fog finally lifted. We covered every trail in a 5-mile radius, checked every campsite and water source. Nothing. It was like she'd never existed. But that night, things got worse. I was staying late at the ranger station, going through missing person reports from the past few months. What I found made my blood run cold. 17 people had vanished in the Angeles National Forest since June. 17 people, all in the same general area where we'd lost Janet Mills. The pattern was always the same. Hikers would be with partners or groups, then suddenly they'd be gone. No signs of struggle, no bodies ever found, no tracks leading away from the last known location, just empty space where a person used to be. I was deep in the files when I heard footsteps outside the station, heavy boots on gravel, moving slowly toward the front door. I looked at the clock to 11:30 p.m., way too late for anyone to be visiting the station. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could see a shadow through the frosted glass window, the outline of someone standing there, but they weren't knocking, weren't calling out, just standing. "Hello," I called. "Station's closed. If this is an emergency, you need to call 911. No response. The shadow didn't move. I walked over to the door and peered through the window. There was definitely someone out there, but I couldn't make out any details. Just a human-shaped darkness against the parking lot lights. When I opened the door, no one was there, but in the gravel where the person had been standing, I found footprints, not boot prints or shoe prints. These looked like they'd been made by bare feet, but they were too deep, like whoever made them weighed much more than a normal person should, and they were cold, not just cool from the night air, but actually cold to the touch, like they'd been pressed into ice instead of gravel. I followed the prints across the parking lot. They led to the edge of the forest, then stopped abruptly. At the tree line, no more prints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had entered the woods, but I could feel something watching me from the darkness between the trees, something that knew I was looking for it, and was looking right back at me. That's when my radio came to life, not with headquarters or any of the other rangers, with Janet Mills' voice, clear as day. "Rebecca, I can see you standing there. You're so close. Why can't you help me?" I grabbed the radio. "Janet, where are you? Can you see any landmarks?" "I'm right here. I'm standing right next to you. Can't you see me?" I spun around, looking in all directions. The parking lot was empty, except for my truck and the official ranger vehicles. Nothing else, no one else. "Janet, I can't see you. Try to describe what you see around you." "Static then. The trees are wrong. They're the same trees, but they're wrong. And there are other people here, lots of other people. They're all looking for their families, but their families can't see them anymore." The radio went dead. I tried everything, changing channels, adjusting the antenna, even switching to my backup unit. Nothing but static. But as I stood there in the empty parking lot, I could have sworn I heard voices in the forest. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all of them calling out names, all of them sounding lost and desperate and afraid, all of them sounding like they were calling from very far away. The next morning, James didn't show up for work. I waited until noon, then drove to his house in La Crescenta. His wife, Carol, met me at the door with red eyes and coffee-stained clothes. "He's been acting so strange lately," she said, talking about shadows and voices. staying up all night writing in that notebook of his. Yesterday he told me he might. They have to go away for a while to fix something that went wrong. I asked to see his notebook, and what I found there made my hands shake. Page after page of entries, all in James' handwriting, but describing things that couldn't possibly be real. The shadow realm overlaps our world in specific locations. The boundary is thin in areas of high electromagnetic activity. Entities are former humans who became trapped between dimensions. They sustain themselves by pulling life force from people who cross the boundary. Time moves differently there. Minutes in our world equal days in theirs. Extended exposure causes cellular breakdown. The final entry was dated yesterday. I've been there too long. My body is breaking down at the molecular level. But I understand now how to close the portal. Someone has to take my place on the other side to maintain the barrier. Carol told me James had left the house at 4 a.m., carrying a backpack full of electronic equipment and high-powered flashlights. He'd kissed her goodbye and said, "If I don't come back, tell Becky she was right about everything." I knew where he'd gone. The same area where Janet Mills had disappeared, where all the others had vanished. Grid 23B, according to his notebook. I loaded my truck with every piece of electronic equipment I could find. Spotlights, flares, batteries, a portable generator. If James was right about the entities being weakened by light, I was going to bring enough light to blind them. The fog was already rolling in when I reached the trailhead. But this time it was different. Thicker, darker, and it seemed to be moving with purpose, instead of just drifting on the wind. As I hiked up the Eagle Rock Trail, the fog formed shapes. Human shapes that walked alongside me for a few steps before dissolving back into mist. I found James at the exact spot where Janet Mills had disappeared. He was sitting on the flat rock where we'd found her water bottle, and he looked like he'd aged 20 years overnight. His hair was completely grey. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his hands shook like an old man's. "Becky," he said when he saw me, "you shouldn't have come here." "James, what happened to you?" He held up his hands, and I could see through them. Not completely, but like he was fading away, becoming translucent. I've been crossing back and forth, trying to understand how it works. Each time I come back, I'm a little less solid. Behind him, the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But instead of heat distortion, this was something else. Reality itself was bending, creating a window into somewhere else. Through the window, I could see another version of the forest. The trees were the same, but they were made of shadow instead of wood. The ground was the same, but it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. And standing among the shadow trees were people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all of them looking lost and afraid and desperate. "That's where they are," James said. "Janet Mills and all the others. They're trapped in the shadow realm, in the spaces between our world and somewhere else." As I watched, some of the shadow people began moving toward the window. They pressed against it like they were pressing against glass, and I could hear their voices faintly, calling out names, begging for help. "We have to get them out," I said. James shook his head. "The portal is unstable. Every time someone crosses over, it gets a little bigger. If it keeps growing, the shadow realm will start bleeding into our world permanently." That's when I saw it. The thing that had been taking people emerged from the shadow forest like darkness given form, roughly human-shaped but wrong in every detail, too tall, too thin, with arms that bent in places where arms shouldn't bend, where its face should have been. There was just empty space that seemed to pull light into it. "It feeds on life force," James whispered. "Every person it takes makes it stronger, and it's been feeding for a long time." The entity noticed us watching and began moving toward the portal. As it got closer, the temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the trees around us. My flashlight beam bent and twisted, pulled toward the creature like it was a black hole made of hungry darkness. "James, we need to run." But James was already standing up, pulling equipment from his backpack, flares, spotlights, a car battery with jumper cables attached. "I figured out how to close it," he said. "But someone has to stay on the other side to maintain the seal." The entity reached the portal. One of its impossible arms stretched through the window between worlds, reaching for us. Where it touched our reality, plants withered and died instantly. James lit 3 road flares and threw them at the creature. The intense light caused it to recoil, making a sound like wind through empty spaces. "Light hurts them," he said, "but only intense, artificial light. Sunlight doesn't work, it has to be electric. I set up the portable spotlight and aimed it at the portal. The beam cut through the shadow realm like a sword, and the trapped people moved away from it, deeper, into the darkness. They're afraid of the light too, I realized. No, James said, connecting the car battery to a powerful halogen work light. They're not afraid of it. They're protecting themselves from it. Light is poison to anything that exists in the shadow realm, even the people who are trapped there. The entity was adapting, learning to avoid the light beams. It moved around the edges of the portal, looking for a way to reach us without getting burned. And it was getting smarter, using the electromagnetic field to turn our own equipment against us. My radio came to life with a sound like screaming static. The battery in my flashlight overheated and exploded. Even the car battery began sparking and smoking. It's overloading everything, James said. We don't have much time. He grabbed the jumper cables and looked at me with eyes that were already more ghost than human. Tell Carol I love her, and tell headquarters to install high-intensity lighting on all the trails, motion sensors, solar-powered, as bright as they can make them. James, no, but he was already stepping toward the portal, carrying the live electrical cables. Someone has to close it from the other side, and I'm already halfway gone anyway. The entity sensed what he was planning and lunged toward him, but James dove through the portal at the last second, disappearing into the shadow realm. For a moment, I could see him on the other side, touching the electrical cables to something that looked like a massive shadow tree. The portal began to collapse with a sound like reality tearing. The entity let out a shriek that I felt in my bones, then was sucked back into the shadow realm as the window between worlds snapped shut. The sudden silence was deafening. No more voices, no more electromagnetic interference, no more impossible, cold, just normal forest sounds, birds, wind in the trees, my own ragged breathing. But James was gone, and so were all the people who'd been trapped in the shadow realm. The official report blamed the disappearances on unusual weather conditions. Unseasonably heavy fog, combined with Santa Ana wind patterns, had created localized atmospheric distortions that caused disorientation and hallucinations. People got lost, wandered off cliffs, or died of exposure, and their bodies were carried away by wildlife. It was a neat explanation that satisfied the bureaucrats and the insurance companies. The families of the missing people weren't as easily convinced, but without bodies or evidence, there wasn't much they could do except grieve and wonder. I kept my mouth shut about what really happened. Who would believe me? Shadow realms and dimensional portals sounded like something out of a bad science fiction movie, not a ranger's incident report. But I made sure that section of the forest got the lighting upgrade it needed. I filed dozens of safety reports, citing the unusual number of accidents and disappearances in that area. I pulled every string I had, called in every favor, and made myself such a pain in the ass that headquarters finally approved that the installation of motion sensor light systems along all the major trails, high-intensity, solar-powered LED spotlights, bright enough to blind you if you looked directly at them. The kind of artificial light that James had said would hurt anything from the shadow realm. The disappearances stopped after that. Oh, we still got the occasional lost hiker or camping accident, but nothing like the systematic vanishing that had been happening before. The electromagnetic anomalies faded away, and the electronics worked normally again. But I kept carrying industrial-strength flashlights on my patrols, and I kept monitoring the EM readings in that area, watching for any sign that the portal might be trying to reopen. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, I thought I could hear voices in the forest. Distant, faint, like people calling from very far away. But when I followed the sounds, I never found anyone. Just empty trails and normal forest sounds. I retired from the Forest Service in 2010, after 18 years of keeping watch over those mountains. The official reason was a back injury from a rescue operation. The real reason was that I was tired of listening for voices that might or might not be there. But I still live in La Crescenta, just 20 minutes from the forest, and I still drive up to the trailhead sometimes, especially when the fog rolls in heavy from the coast. I park at the edge of the woods and listen, making sure the silence stays normal. Most nights, it does. But sometimes, when the fog is particularly thick and the motion sensors are triggering the security lights in sequence, I see shapes moving between the trees. Human shapes that don't quite move like humans should. They stay just outside the range of the lights, testing the barriers, looking for weak spots. I've started carrying a police scanner in my truck. When the shapes are moving, the scanner picks up voices, not the usual police and fire department chatter, but older voices. Voices from decades past, speaking in languages I don't recognize, all of them sounding lost and desperate and afraid. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear James' voice among them. He's still out there, still keeping watch from the other side, still making sure the portal stays closed. But I wonder how long he can keep it up. And I wonder what will happen when the motion sensors finally break down, when the LED lights burn out, when the solar batteries fail, and the darkness comes creeping back. I've trained 3 other rangers to watch for the signs: electromagnetic anomalies, missing time, voices on the radio that shouldn't be there. I've given them copies of James' notebook, even though they think I'm just a crazy old lady with too much imagination. Maybe they're right. Maybe the whole thing was just stress and isolation, and too many years of staring into dark forests. Maybe there never was a shadow realm, never was an entity that fed on human life force, never was a portal that needed to be sealed. But I don't think so, because last week, during a particularly heavy fog, one of the motion sensors failed. Grid 23B, right where Janet Mills disappeared. The light went out at 3:17 a.m., and it stayed out until morning. By the time the maintenance crew got there to replace the bulb, they found something interesting. Footprints in the soft earth around the light post, not boot prints or shoe prints, bare feet, too deep, like they'd been made by someone much heavier than they should be, and they were cold. I've put in a work order for backup lighting in that area. Double redundancy, battery backup, everything I can think of, but I know it's not enough. It's never going to be enough, because the things in the shadow realm are patient. They've been waiting for decades, maybe centuries. They can wait a little longer, but eventually the lights will fail, the barriers will weaken, and when they do, the hungry darkness will come creeping back into our world, looking for more people to feed on. I just hope someone will be watching when it happens, someone who knows the signs, who carries the right equipment, who understands that some hungers can never be satisfied, someone who remembers that the space between the trees is not always empty. My name is Rebecca Thorne, and this is what really happened in the Angeles National Forest in September 1992. I'm telling you this story because you need to know, because someone needs to keep watching, because the shadows are always listening, and they're always hungry.